Hello, everybody. I'm Ed Haigh, Strategy Director here at Encompass Equality. And I wanted to share with you some new insights following our recent survey of men. Now, this is all part of our Why Women Leave research that we launched back in summer of 2023. And it's perhaps worth just saying a few words about that before I jump in, because kind of the place that this new male data plays in this piece of research is kind of important. So just to recap, in 2023, April and May of 2023, we surveyed just over 4,000 women about the reasons that influence their decisions to stay with or leave their employer. And that generated some really interesting insights. But one thing that was missing from that was context, which is to say, how did those results compare with what men were saying, for example? And so at the beginning of 2024, we undertook to essentially ask men the same questions. We had to make one or two slight tweaks, but essentially the same set of questions. And we had responses from about 1,400 men in the course of doing that. And so what this is an opportunity to contextualize the information that we already have about women, rather than to provide you with a sort of specific, in-depth series of insights about men themselves. This was always intended to help us shine light on the female data. So the way we need to really think about this is as if we're just sort of merging these two data sets and looking at the female data through the lens of the male data to see what it reveals. What we're really interested in here is, where are the differences between men and women? So let's just kind of recap where we got to, the sort of headline findings from the survey of women. The first of those was that the average woman says that she's 38% likely to leave her employer in the next 2 years. As a reminder, the reason we asked about 2 years rather than one was that we wanted to capture women's intention to leave as well as their sort of committed action. We were concerned that if we asked about 12 months, we would somehow miss women who were pretty much decided that they were going to look for another opportunity, but didn't have a sort of committed action plan to do that. In the event, actually, the figure that we came at is very similar to similar studies that have been done based on 12 months. So 38% is a number that will be quite familiar to quite a lot of people. Of course, what we didn't know then was how to kind of contextualize that, and that's one of the reasons that we wanted to speak to men. The other really big message that came through the research in a number of different forms was this idea that in thinking about what influences their decisions about whether to stay or go, women were essentially saying to their employers, the problem here isn't me, the problem is you. The problem isn't, for example, my menopause symptoms, though they may be difficult things to deal with and might have an influence on things. Actually, the problem is much more how my line manager responds to the situation in which I find myself. The problem isn't that I've got childcare needs in and of itself. The problem is the lack of flexibility that my employer's offering me. And there was a really powerful analogy, I think, that kind of sits behind that, which is this idea of goldfish in a bowl. And most employers taking the approach of removing the goldfish from the bowl, giving them a nice polish up, pampering them, looking after them really nicely, and then putting them back into murky water. And that really, I think, kind of explains quite nicely the big message that we were getting from women through this survey, which is, if you really want to resolve the problems, that resolve the things that really influence my decisions about whether to stay or go, then you need to deal with those at a cultural and a systemic level. You need, in terms of this analogy, to clean the water, not the goldfish. So that came through very strongly as a message in the research. In looking at the various things that women told us about what influenced their decisions to stay and how they feel about things at the moment, we arrived at 5 priorities for employers in terms of helping to retain women. And they were firstly prospects for career progression. This really kind of stood out as being something that was very important. Very often when women are sort of moving closer to the exit door, this is the thing that's gone wrong. Organisational culture, perhaps unsurprisingly, really stood out as a really prominent factor here, as did support from line managers. And again, that very much, I think, chimes with a lot of research that's been done in this space before. We found a lot of women talking about the day-to-day work itself, just what it's like to do the job that they're paid to do on a kind of day-to-day basis, the kind of the head-down type of experience of being at work. And then we found a lot of women talking about the amount of work that they were asked to do relative to the hours that they were contracted to do, or to put it another way, overwork. And that's a theme that's going to crop up again and again throughout the session today. So really, these kind of 5 priorities started to emerge through that first piece of research, and we could be fairly confident based on that these were the things that really matter to women. What we didn't know is whether they also matter to men, whether they are not only matter to women but are specific to women, and that's now something that we can speak about with a bit more authority, having surveyed men. So what happens when we start to look at this data through the lens of the male data? Well, the first thing is we see that actually men and women show a very similar propensity to say that they're likely to leave their employer. In fact, we've had to make some slight adjustments to the female data to make sure that we're kind of comparing with apples with apples, which moves that 38% figure up to about 41. Not significant change. And men actually say that they're about 38% likely to leave. So actually, kind of comparing with apples, men are slightly less likely to leave than women, but really not significantly. There aren't big differences here at all. Men and women show a very similar level of propensity to leave their employer. So no massive differences there. Where are there differences then? Well, the first major thing to say here is that, you know, we spend a lot of time asking both men and women about the factors that influence their decisions about whether to stay or go, and kind of what matters and what doesn't matter. And the first really big message to emerge when we overlay these 2 data sets and look at the female data through the lens of the male data is that everything seems to matter more to women. Some of you will be familiar with this retention matrix that we showed when we launched our main report, which shows 2 things. It shows firstly the impact of factors on decisions to stay or go. So the closer to the top of the chart a factor is, the more it matters, the more it influences decisions. And then we also asked them about whether these factors were something that they currently felt positively or negatively about. So what was the kind of nature of the impact at the moment? And broadly speaking, as we shared before, what we see here is a very positive picture in which the things that matter most are also the things about which women tend to be most positive. So quite a positive picture, but here already we start to see those things that really stand out in terms of being the most important. So things like support from line managers, the day-to-day work itself, culture, flexibility, team, amount of work, these things really kind of stand out. So that's how the picture looked for women. Rather than show you the same picture for men, which actually isn't going to make it terribly easy to compare, I want to show you that in a slightly different way. And just sort of show each of these. Now I'm just looking at the one dimension of that chart here that was the kind of vertical axis. So I'm just now looking at the impact of all these factors on decisions about whether to stay or go. And we show women here in blue and men in orange, or kind of apricot. And what we can see is, and by the way, the numbers on the left-hand axis here are the score that we have converted answers into. And what we see here is that for every single one of these factors, women are more likely to say that this has a significant impact on their decisions about whether to stay or go than men do. And in some cases that difference is really quite significant. But I think the key thing here is that for every single factor, women say these things matter more than men do. And I think that really brings to the fore this idea that was really actually the front of our minds when we started doing this research in the first place, which is this idea of retention as sort of an equation in women's mind, that there are many things that they're trying to balance in making their decisions about whether to stay with or leave their employer. there are a lot of things going on in their lives, both outside of work and inside of work, and they're trying to make this thing balance. And, most obviously, kind of in microcosm, we see that in a financial sense. So, does the amount of money that I bring in through my salary outweigh the cost that I pay in childcare, for example? Do those two things balance out? What's the balance of that equation? But I think it also applies in a broader sense, this idea that women are trying to balance more things, underpinned, of course, by the fact that many are still playing a much more traditional role within the home, and so that they are really trying to actively balance work with things like childcare and elder care, as well as their own sort of physical and mental health challenges. And what it does is kind of brings to the fore this idea that for women, decisions about whether to stay with or leave their employer exist in a much more dynamic state than they do for men. This is a decision that is constantly in the balance, that is constantly being assessed. And so all of those factors, which of course are important to men as well, which of course influence men's decisions, are just a bit more important to women. They're being scrutinized just a bit more. This equation is being assessed in a more kind of dynamic state than it is for men. The good news about that, of course, is that means employers can do more. So whereas for men, these decisions seem to be a slightly more kind of static thing, they seem to be slightly less influenced by these kind of factors. For women, because they really are influenced, the extent to which those factors are seen in positive or negative terms can have a real influence. So there's more an employer can do here to retain women than there is for men. If we just organise now those differences from sort of greatest to smallest, that starts to reveal something interesting as well. So where are the differences between men and women greatest, and where are they smallest in terms of the impact of these factors? And we see a bunch of factors out on the left-hand side of this chart where they're really quite significant differences. And when we talk about things like flexibility from the perspective of time here, childcare, special leave, and flexibility also from a location perspective, as well as perhaps physical and mental health, these really stand out. These are big differences between women and men. Whereas at the other end of the chart, they are much less so. So we can sort of say of those things, the things on the left are things on which gender has a greater influence than it does on the things on the right. So salary and benefits, for example, whilst it's very important to women, is also very important to men. There's not a really significant difference here, but that issue of flexibility, which shows up in these two guises of time and location, matters a lot more to women than it does to men. And actually often what we see, and you can see running through quite a few of these factors out on the left-hand side of this chart, are things that have a kind of time dimension to them. Amount of work, flexibility, special leave. This is all about the amount of time that women are asked to work versus how much time they have away from work. So that's a consistent theme that keeps cropping up for us. So we've got a bunch of things that gender has a big impact on, and a bunch of things that gender has much less of an impact on. It's perhaps worth just also mentioning career progression, since we already talked about that being something really important. In fact, though it is really important to women, it's also really important to men, and the differences here aren't really significant. It's perhaps worth actually just layering on those 5 priorities that we identified in our last report. You remember I talked about the 5 sort of main things that we decided should be priorities based on the female research alone. Just show them here in yellow, so we can now see, we know what's important to women, but we can now sort of see whether they are also important to men. And actually what we see is that most of those, 4 of those 5 priorities, actually sit in this kind of grouping of issues on which gender has less of an influence. The one that stands out here, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, is amount of work. That is both a factor that we know to be very important to women, and that we know to be more important to women than it is to men. So that's the sort of impact of these. That's the impact of these various factors on decisions about whether to stay or go. What about how women feel about these things and how that compares with men? Well, the next really big message to emerge from the research or through looking at the male data is that by and large, women's experience is less positive than men's. Let's kind of quantify that in some way. So let's show you the same chart that we showed for impact now about sentiment. So I'm showing you the difference in sentiment scores from men and women. Women again in blue, men in orange. And we can see that in most cases, the score is a little lower for women than it is for men. It's a little less positive or a little more negative. So across all of these factors, at least across most of these factors, women are a little less happy than men. Let's kind of organise those again in terms of those differences to look at where the differences are greatest and where they're smallest. Because there are actually some factors here that women speak more positively about than men. And interestingly, amongst them is career progression. So again, we know that's really important to women, but actually they're slightly happier about their prospects for career progression at the moment than men are. And flexibility from a location perspective, at least, you know, in terms of where they work, very important to women, but actually something that they're slightly happy about than men. And then we've got these factors about which women are more negative to varying degrees, and some that they're really quite significantly more negative about. And the ones that really stand out here are physical and mental health challenges. That's something that women speak a lot more negatively about at the moment than do men. The availability and extent of special leave, which perhaps unsurprisingly probably has an effect on women more than it does on men. But look at the biggest one again, amount of work. It's really standing out here. Women are quite a bit less positive than men about the amount of work that they're asked to do relative to the hours that they're contracted to work. And let's again just show those five priorities. Forgive me, culture hasn't managed to show up as yellow here, but that was, if you remember, that was our fifth one. Let's now kind of layer back on those five priorities. We talked about career progression already. There's line management, which again we know to be a very important thing, and something that women are a little less positive about than men. But once again, this is where this issue of amount of work really starts to stand out. It really matters to women. It matters more to women than men, and it's something about which they tend to be quite a bit more negative than men. And that's a message that just starts to emerge through the research time and time again. It really does start to kind of come to the fore, and it's something that I think we need to pay attention to. I think the reality sitting behind this is that because women continue in many cases to play quite a traditional role within the workplace, they need to kind of put hard boundaries around their work in a way that many men don't. And so overwork is a far greater challenge for them than it is for men. And I think that's a topic that goes quite significantly under-talked about, under-reported. Why? Well, firstly, because women themselves, I think, don't necessarily want to bring the topic up, because having a conversation about needing to work less sounds a bit like, you know, admitting to being less loyal, to being less committed, to being lazier, to being less professional. These kind of quite unhelpful sort of thoughts and kind of associations, I think, come into play here. And so I think women are kind of standing back from sort of having this conversation too actively, not all the time, but I think it goes a bit kind of under the radar for those reasons. Employers, by the same token, don't really want to have the conversation, because the truth is that there's an awful lot of work that's not being paid for, at least in not any kind of explicit contractual and commercial sense. There's an awful lot of overtime that's going on. Back of an envelope calculation based on our data says that something like 10% of all the hours being worked aren't actually being paid for in any kind of explicit contractual sense. So women themselves don't seem to have much of an incentive, or it feels like a very big risk to be sort of trying to have this conversation about overwork, and employers don't have a huge amount of incentive to do it. But there it is sitting under the surface, and I think it really matters. And I think more than anything else, that's what this new male data reveals in terms of the light it shines on the female data. I think it shows more than anything else that we need to have a look at this issue of overwork. I'm really interested to see recent research by Deloitte in this space as well. They've recently published their Women at Work 24 report. And within that, they've got some incredibly powerful data about the difference or the effect that working overtime has on a number of different metrics for women. And perhaps most starkly is the metric about loyalty to your employer. I think women who aren't working overtime describe, about a quarter of them, 25% describe their loyalty to their employer as, who aren't working overtime, about 70% of them describe their loyalty as either good or very good, whereas only a quarter who are working overtime say the same thing. So there's some really quite stark and powerful data emerging from a number of different sources on this. I think this is where we need to go. I think this is the really important and underreported piece of the retention jigsaw. And difficult though it is, I think we need to start finding ways to tackle this from both a practical and a cultural dimension, because both of those factors, both of those dimensions are really important here. There are all sorts of challenging practical reasons why overwork is a difficult thing to grapple with, but there is also a cultural dimension to this that needs looking at. So that's the really key message that I think emerges through this new data and what it shows about the female data that we already have. If you want to find out more about that, you can download the research paper from our website. Please do that. You can use the QR code here, and do get in touch with us if you have any questions. We'd love to hear from you and have the chance to talk about the challenges that you're facing and how we might help you to address those.